It is an absolute fact that there was no racism before 1859 and Charles Darwin when he invented it. Now, that's absolutely astounding, but it's absolutely true. Think about it. The historical record, the historical writers are devoid of the thing we call racism, of the concept we call racism. The idea that somehow because of your physical color of your skin, that somehow that actually relates to physical properties, physical behavior, your intelligence level, or whatever. It's devoid of the record, of the historical record, till Darwin invents it in 1859. We're going to credit Darwin for doing it for the moment. But this is episode number 2A. That's a little sign language. It's for psychohistory, specifically for Darwin, the first part of Darwin. Psychohistory. What's psychohistory? Well, we're reviving psychohistory, and we're giving it an actual historical background and not just science fiction. So the idea would be that the individual evil and flaw of the man is translated onto the movement, and then from the movement onto the adherents. And so, it's always been a question of history: is what do you does the man make does the great man of theory of history? Does the man make the movement, or does the movement make the man? Obviously, it's both. But with the psychohistory, what we're going to do is we're going to try and connect all the dots. We're going to take the individual physical, mental flaw and evil of the individual, and then we're going to show how that translates onto the flaw and the evil and the sin in the movement, and then how that resonates onto the individual adherence to that movement, and then they go off and do the evil and the flaw thing. So in this case, the evil man would be Darwin and his sin of racism, how it translates into scientific Darwinism, which then translates back into the adherence into, for example, Jim Crow laws and the anti-miscegenation laws against interrace marriages and Jim Crow, and our modern concept of racism. Psychohistory is not really a thing, but we're going to make it a thing. And the reason why we're going to do this is my mother, first-rank historian. I once asked her. She taught, ancient world and medieval. I said, why don't you do any American history? She goes, oh, American history is just too young. You have to give it a couple hundred years before things settle out. And that's, historians have always been, prejudiced against fads. Psychohistory obviously has been a fad, but we're going to legitimize it with this procedure. So racism. How was it that there's no racism before 1859? It's absolutely amazing. You have to look at the history of it. And before that, there was no concept of race as we know it. Before that, it makes perfect sense too. A reason why. Before that, all you had to be the other would be from the next town over. So, for example, if you were a Sabine, then your arch enemy, your mortal enemy, would be the Romans, and vice versa. And so the Romans hated Sabines, the Sabines hated the Romans, and they look exactly the same. And it's the same for that in Italy as it is in Africa. If you're a Jabbar, then the Jabbaras right next to you are your mortal enemy, and you all look exactly the same. There's no association with color to anything. If you were different, it's actually not a bad thing. For example, Caesar, who was blonde and blue-eyed, probably because the Gauls, when the barbarian Gauls that he eventually conquered, that's why it was a big deal that when he conquered Gaul, when they came down and they invaded Rome and Italy, and they sacked and raped and murdered everybody. Obviously, one of his ancestors was Gallic, and that's why he was blonde, blue-eyed. But he took it as they took it as part of their family ancestry, that they were related to Venus, and he was touched by the god, and that's why he was blonde, blue-eyed. But there was none of this idea that somehow blonde, blue-eyed people are superior. That only comes in after Darwin allows the invention of it. So before that, though, there was another step. So almost all human history and everywhere, there is no association with color and behavior. Then two particular idiots, Immanuel Kant, who, just so we know where he was, he never left his front parlor, and so he has no experience in the real world. He's only intellectually theorizing about all this nonsense. He associates color and behaviors, to the four races. And the other idiot, particular idiot, David Hume, this moron, he hated God, hated St. Thomas Aquinas, his beautiful causation. He was rebelling against that. So he's this nitwit who said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we don't even know causation exists. You can't say it does because even if you have a billiard board ball and it's done it 100 times, where you hit it a certain way and it bounces a certain way, you don't know if the next time it's going to do that." Yeah, technically that's true, but that doesn't mean you throw out causation. Anyway, just like you can have all the air, coalesce on one end of the room, and then sophisticate, kill me from lack of oxygen right now. That just doesn't happen. No, 99.999% of the time, it doesn't happen. That doesn't mean you throw out the entire thing. Anyway, Hume and Kant associated into the four different colors with behaviors, but it was in a scholarship. It wasn't a science. And so, for example, what does that difference mean? Well, it's a scholarship. You can accept it or you can reject it. And, there's the real world. And in a real world, that might not be the case. And you can reject it. And that's what was happening. So, for example, you can't call Thomas Jefferson a racist because even though he read the scholarship and said, "Oh, okay, if that's the case, then obviously it's the red race, the Indians, who were the most superior race because he believed they were physically hardier than whites and they were smarter than whites." And then he looked at the black race and he said, "Oh, but I worry about the black race. What's going to happen to them? Because they are not." But it could be refuted with actual experience, and it was rebuttable. So scholarship is just rebuttable, and that's exactly what happened. So he wrote a letter saying that the blacks are inferior. A black mathematician from Baltimore wrote him saying, "Well, what do you mean? I'm a mathematician. I'm black, and I'm equal to any white mathematician." And he was, and he met Jefferson, and Jefferson says, "I stand corrected. I was wrong." And so in the scholarship, it was still rebuttable. And so it was a brief period where it was in the scholarship with Kant and Hume, and it was rebuttable. And then along comes Darwin. Now, Darwin was a racist pig. And part of this is he has multiple sins, but for this sin in particular, without a doubt, it's been whitewashed from history. But Darwin's whole reason to exist almost was his inherent racism. He was from the upper English class. He looked down on the Irish. There's a little difference between him and Hitler. The only difference between him and Hitler is that Darwin thought that the lowest of the white races, as he broke them down to, were the Irish, and that they were the ones polluting the English hegemony. And the difference with Hitler is that Hitler, of course, that the Germans were on top, they were the apex race, and that the Jews were the ones that were the lowest. Darwin's book, which has been whitewashed from history, The Origins of Species. The rest of the title was The Origins of Species and Most Favored Races, and you can predict who were the favorite races, right? Obviously the whites. Darwin's also made a statement claiming that the distance between the gorillas and blacks was less than the difference between whites and blacks. So he believed that blacks were just above gorillas, and that's Charles Darwin, and he did this in 1859. And I'll have to get into atheism in another episode, but that is really the inception of the modern day concept of racism. We associate racism, because what Darwin does is he lets the racist have an excuse for the racism. Darwin puts a scientific imprimatur And Darwinism and evolution puts a scientific imprimatur on top of the racism. So whether it was just in the scholarship, it was rebuttable. After Darwin, it becomes not rebuttable. And in that ridiculous movie Inherent the Wind, with that Spencer Tracy, an atheist, what's missed in that is that William Jennings Bryan, one of the great Democrats of all time, who actually kicked off the KKK from the Democratic presidential stage and ran for president 3 times. What William Jennings Bryan was doing was they were resisting the teaching of evolution and Charles Darwinism in the southern states, not because the Southerners were throwbacks, but because the Southerners were Christians, and it's completely against Christian doctrine to believe that somebody is inferior to you. And that's what they were fighting. That's what Inherent the Wind was all about, and that's why they were trying to stop the teaching of Charles Darwin's evolutionary scientific racism to Christians and to Americans, was because it's at its core, it's anti-American. And what happened was this. I look back in history, and what happened was this: when England was sending out the Pilgrims and the Quakers and all the rest of them, and the English diversity spread about, where they were spreading Christianity to the New World and to wherever they came, India, wherever they found. But something happened. At some point, they ran out of Englishmen, and it became too big, and so they needed a new reason to go out and colonize. And the reason became, okay, from we're spreading the good news of the gospel, to, okay, power, and the white man's burden. And that happened when they started running out of people, and they had to start relying on the Irish, and they needed a new reason, raison d'etre, a reason to exist, and it became the white man's burden. And that starts with Darwin. It was in the air, but it's really Darwin who puts the intellectual permission slip, imprimatur, behind it. And I guess I'm the only one that figures that can see that that this is so obvious. Instead of the meek shall inherit the earth, it became the strong shall inherit the earth. And so that evil of racism, of Darwinian racism, gets to pretend trophy award of science, and now it's science saying that blacks are inferior, that whites are superior. And it's that gets then spread. Now, how this translates? It just translates, for example, in the Jim Crow laws. So before the Civil War, the laws against blacks, because there were a bunch of free blacks running around, but enslaved blacks were bad. But after the Civil War and the advent of scientific Darwinism, they become even worse. They become so bad that, for example, the laws against white and black being married, and what constitutes a black person, in Jim Crow South, were so crazy that one drop of black blood in you were, quote, a mulatto, you were, quote, not white. That was so insane that when the Nazis were looking for ways to disarm the Jews and come up with a lot of laws, and to make Jews second-class citizens, they looked to the South and to the Democrat South, and they looked at the laws there, and they saw the laws, and they took all the gun laws, which then became American gun laws. American Southern laws became American national gun laws, but to disarm American people, they were originally to disarm black Americans as slaves, but also the anti-Jewish laws were so crazy that when the Nazis were looking at it, they said, well, what is it to be a Jew and a German? And they look at it and said, well, the anti-Southern, the Jim Crow laws say one drop of black blood and you're no longer white. No, that's just too crazy. Even the Nazis said that was too crazy, and they went with 25%. But because of the science of Darwinism, Jim Crow and the Jim Crow South were able to say, oh, the science says that whites are superior, and that is all at the evil of the foot of good old Charles Darwin and his racism. So the psychohistory goes: Charles Darwin, racism, gets put on the movement of scientific of Darwinism, and then gets translated to its adherents both in the old day Jim Crow laws and today in Planned Parenthood and the wiping out of blacks, with 40% of black births ending in abortion and 50% of all abortions being black. So you have a complete genocide today with Planned Parenthood. And that's Psychohistory, episode 2A.